The election date for the upcoming Polish parliamentary election has finally been determined. On October 15th, one of Poland's most important elections will take place. According to the polls, the ruling party will lose its absolute majority. However, the PiS party may retain the relative majority, meaning that they cannot govern the land alone anymore as they did for the last 8 years, but they will need to find a coalition partner in order to do so. Or, in another scenario, they might be excluded from the government altogether. In this video and in upcoming videos, I will take a look at all the possible government constellations, the background of the major political parties in Poland, and what ramifications the elections may have in the future. So if you want to stay informed on Central European politics, click the like and subscribe buttons. In the last parliamentary election in Poland, the Law and Justice Party, or Prawo i Sprawiedliwość, has gained 43% of the popular vote. However, due to the seat allocation system called the D'Hondt method, which is used in Polish parliamentary elections, the PiS and its minor allies eventually received a little more than 50% of the seats in the Polish parliament, which gave the bloc around the PiS party an absolute majority. With the PiS currently polling at around 33%, it is bound to lose that absolute majority. And since there is no other party stronger than the PiS, this will result in a hung parliament. This loss of around 10% of the electorate seems kind of odd at the first glance, since the Polish economy improved a lot since the beginning of the party's rule in 2015. Also, a lot of social programs like childcare money were introduced under the party's leadership. The decline in the party's popularity can be explained in multiple ways. The strengthening of opposition parties, thus giving the population more viable alternatives. A change in the country's demographics, with the PiS party's elderly voting base slowly disappearing, and never-ending controversies around the judicial court, causing frequent protests and demonstrations. Chief among these in the last 3 years alone were the women's strike starting in 2020 and the EU protests following a decision made by the judicial court to reject the notion of the primacy of the EU law, and protests over the alleged threatening over the independence of the media. It is important to note at this point that the Polish Constitutional Court has been a source of controversy for years. The PiS party has tried to replace old judges with new judges favorable to them in the court during their reign. Therefore, the political independence of the Constitutional Court is highly questionable. The biggest wave of demonstrations during the rule of the PiS party so far has occurred very recently, however, over the course of July this year. It all started with the Polish president Andrzej Duda announcing in May 2023 that he would support a bill that would allow a committee to investigate politicians who have sabotaged Polish interests and allowed Russia to influence the Polish economy during the years 2007 and 2015. At first you may be thinking that investigating politicians who have made shady deals with Russia might not be such an unreasonable thing, since fear of Russian domination is a big anxiety in Poland, and politicians who have courted Vladimir Putin, the president that is currently waging war on Poland's neighbor country Ukraine, need to be investigated as to whether or not they had shady interests in mind. However, the dates given might strike you as oddly specific. In fact, the current opposition party PO ruled the country between 2007 and 2015. And the current opposition leader, Donald Tusk, has been the Prime Minister of Poland between those years. And during his tenure as Prime Minister, there have been times at which the Polish-Russian relationship has been more amicable than before, although it is also of note that those Polish-Russian reapproachments during Tusk's prime ministership were not long-lasting, because of events such as the Smolensk disaster and the Russian annexation of Crimea. But those are stories for another day. Back to the law. It is widely speculated that this law has been introduced specifically to target Tusk. The committee was supposed to publish its verdict in mid-September, a month before the elections, and all those politicians who would be found guilty would lose their passive voting rights, meaning they would not be able to run for offices anymore. If that law would have been signed, the ruling PiS party would have easily been able to eliminate their main competitor out of the race. As you can guess, the outrage has been immediate, and another wave of demonstrations followed. The exact number of participants is disputed, although the demonstrations are widely regarded as the biggest demonstrations in years. Due to the backlash, the leadership of PiS eventually had to battle back. The signing of the law has been postponed and postponed, and at the current moment, it seems like the law will not be signed at all. So, the only effect this proposed law had was that it deepened the divide between the two major parties and even further polarized the country politically even more. Which is quite the achievement, because the hatred between the leadership of PiS and PO goes back decades at this point. This was not always the case. Both the PO and PiS can trace their origins back to the Solidarność movement, which was an oppositional movement in the 80s against the Communist Party that was ruling at the time. The leaders of both parties that are currently hating each other have been active in that movement. The communist rule was eventually overthrown, and Solidarność politicians now dominated the Polish political environment. Although the Solidarność movement split up into many different factions in the 90s, both the PiS and PO were formed in 2001 respectively, by the Kaczynski twins and Donald Tusk and his associates. PiS, Prawo i Sprawiedliwość, literally means law and justice, and they follow a more national religious blend of conservatism, while the PO, literally civic platform, is rather liberal conservative, with a strong emphasis on the free market. Relations between the two parties were good at first, and the cooperation between PiS and PO even went as far as forming a common electoral committee for the 2002 regional elections in Poland, called POPIS. Both parties were newcomers at the time, and due to the similar roots, they decided to run on the same list, in order to enhance their chances in the election. In the following parliamentary elections of 2005, they decided to run on separate lists. Both parties received significant hype before the election, and PO managed to occupy the second place, while PiS won the election. PiS and PO would win the first two places in any national election in Poland from this point on to today. Despite the parties' decisions to run on separate lists, the relationship between PiS and PO remained amicable until the end of the elections. With both parties doing so well, they were expected to form a coalition government with each other. The ensuing talks to form a coalition failed, however, and the PiS formed a coalition with two far-right populist parties. This perceived betrayal was the first point of contention between the two parties amongst many. The PiS government lasted until 2007, when one of the leaders of one of the junior partners of the coalition was accused of misconduct. Kaczynski decided to call in snap elections, and PO turned out to be the clear winner at this time. Donald Tusk decided to return the favor to Kaczynski by choosing a coalition partner other than him. The coalition between PO and the minor social conservative PSL lasted for 2 election cycles until 2015, when, after a string of scandals, PiS returned in full force. In the last 2 elections, PiS managed to gain an absolute majority in parliament, and therefore weren't reliant on coalition partners. This is most likely bound to change in the upcoming elections, so one can ask a question: will we see a return of POPIS? A government formed by the 2 most popular parties in Poland? After all, together both parties would reach a 2/3 majority, a so-called supermajority. Such a coalition would be able to alter the constitution at will. However, the plain answer to this question is, most likely it will not happen. Surprises happen quite often in Polish politics, so this option can't be entirely ruled out, but such a scenario is very unlikely nevertheless. The hatred between the two parties goes a long way at this point. The distrust between the establishments of both parties goes deep. The struggle over influence over the judicial court has left deep wounds in that regard. The political agendas have simply changed since 2002, when PiS and PO were allies. Nowadays, the relationship of Poland to the EU, abortion rights, and LGBTQ policy come to dominate Polish political discussion, and PiS and PO are taking the opposite sides on each of those discussions. So in the end, either the PO or PiS might form a coalition with 1 or 2 of the 3 minor parties that are projected to enter the Sejm. These parties have the potential to become kingmakers after the election. In the future, I plan to post more content on Central European politics, so stay tuned.